Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we've got the security team here to talk about their take on the Black Hat and DefCon conferences, and they're just back from them. So I want to welcome Scott Crawford, Dan Kennedy, Justin Lam, and Mark Ehr. Welcome back to the podcast to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Wonderful.
There is so much to talk about. On a certain level, it was all things AI. It was all things AI security, and so much thrown in. But Dan, why don't you kick us off with just a little bit of background? And we've been talking before this about what you took away from Mikko Hyppinen's keynote. What's your take?
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I enjoy Jeff Moss's opening comments every year. It kind of gives me a model of what to expect. And then this year's keynote, it was good to see a familiar face, Mikko, long of F-Secure, a Finnish endpoint security vendor. Now I know he's working on drones and drone security. But it was interesting to get a historical sort of retrospective from him in what feels like a moment of profound change. I mean, we're a couple of years into the generative AI journey. We're certainly knee-deep in agentic at the moment. And it struck me that he at one point showed a picture of him holding a bunch of floppy disks. So he had about 100 of them. And on them individually was every major computer virus at the time. There are about a little over 100 of them. And what struck me the most was the world was knowable back then. And back then wasn't that long ago. So he had that. And then his other interesting point was about phishing. And I just found it funny. It's like the advice we give, blame the user is way out of vogue. And we see that in our Voice of the Enterprise studies. User behavior was the number one pain point. Now it's kind of leaving the chart, even though user behavior hasn't changed. Blame the user is out. And Mikko made the point that like every phishing thing starts with in the news, a user clicked a link. And his point for the security industry is the user should never have been presented that link. And our advice is still dated on these sophisticated attacks. And now they're sort of Gen AI-enabled business email compromise. And we saw that in Vote 2. We saw 2 years ago, CISOs were like, yeah, this isn't a problem. And then more recently, they said it's a huge problem. And it's one of those rare data points that completely reverses in 12 months. And it's not surprising, but a lot of our clients are taking that data point and putting it in their blogs and quotes and running with it because they're trying to make a point about email security. And they made a point at Black Hat that, our advice is still educate the users and conduct anti-phishing. And to a certain extent, it feels like we're fighting guided missiles with water pistols at this point. And, we're in Vegas, and lest we forget, we're only, 2 years removed from Scattered Spider and the MGM Caesar attacks. And those were social engineering attacks. They were attacks on identity systems, but the weakness was in the reset process. And honestly, how could we forget with CrowdStrike's giant personifications of these APTs?
And the weakness that is the human in the loop, which, people still present some challenges, but we are struggling to be able to get the technical controls put in place to be able to address this.
I was kind of saw that as something of a failure of the industry anyway. Blame people for crappy implementations of crappy technology and then throw the people who are using it, who don't have a choice often, under the bus for making decisions based on an implementation that might have made sense to a software engineer, but to the average person using it. So yeah, user experience really does matter. And I know a lot of front-end developers know that backwards and forwards, but it is so past being something that we even talk about, that a user clicked on that there's a lot in that audience, I'm sure, agreed with Mikko in that, on that point of view.
But I guess we are going to rely on agents to fix all that, right?
Undoubtedly. I mean, if you look at the pitches, there were over 400 exhibitors in the business hall at Black Hat this year. Several more participants at DefCon. Mark and Justin were both at DefCon, so they probably have some point of view on that. But yes, it's hardly surprising that AI was the flavor of the month, the year, maybe this part of the decade, agentic having taken center stage now. this year. And of course, seeing a lot of plays on the show floor. A couple of thoughts about that, about AI generally in the state of presented here at the, so Mark and I were at the AI Summit on Tuesday. And one of the things that struck me about that, and really about the technical demonstrations of threats generally, is that in the past you become comfortable with the idea that presenters were going to showcase, deep expertise in developing very detailed attack tactics, so defenders can be better informed about what they're up against and to implement defenses that are current with the threat landscape. What seemed evident this year was that the level of technical depth seemed to be shallow compared to some prior years, and that's because the access to freely available AI tools makes it possible that if you have just a good idea, regardless what your technical chops are, if you can find the tools to pull off your idea, then AI capabilities make that much more accessible to a much larger swath of potential threat actors than before. So on the one hand, it lowers the barrier to entry for more technical threats in certain cases, but it also considerably has the potential to expand the threat landscape as well too. So yeah, Mark, you were there at the AI Summit as well.
I was going to point out, we've historically derided the idea of script kiddie attackers, those that leverage the tools that others have put together, and because they just weren't good enough or skilled enough or elite enough attackers to be able to build their own stuff. With AI, we've sort of blown through the script kiddie world, and we are not in Kansas anymore.
No, Claude Code and this other things have really enabled anyone to become a script kiddie of sorts. I think it's really interesting how difficult the volume of attacks, certainly the attack surface area, all the complexity that has been brought up, and it's adding more and more challenges. Even at DefCon, many of the traditional CTFs have to be Claude Code proofed in order to make sure that it really is a human contestant. And we just see that across so many of the villages. I think that you really want to be able to test against both, sort of machine or Gen AI in sort of attacks, but also human attacks, and both of those, you have to keep those both into account. And I think that it's just going to be exceedingly difficult for security teams going forward.
Well, it's one of those things that I guess there's a debate to be had. You're talking about the capture the flag competitions. The idea that we're going to keep automated participants out. It's when do we hand over the keys to our robot overlords?
Right. My takeaway on the AI Summit too, kind of to echo what Scott was saying is, I went to the technical track in the afternoon expecting very deep technical content. And really, it occurs to me, looking back on it, that I think that, those of us, like industry analysts, we live and breathe a lot of this stuff every day. Right. And so we're sort of steeped in it. But I think a lot of the folks that attend things like that aren't. And I think one of the reasons why it may have been a little more high level is that a lot of those folks just aren't that steeped in it. They really need a little bit more of the basics, which is what was delivered. That said, I think, they could have definitely used more depth, but I think that's why.
Well, so this raises a question, because this is something that I think we'd seen in years past, which was the broadening of the audience for both Black Hat and DefCon. And where you had those basically fairly niche, the practitioners, folks who were relatively deep in the technology, that now the conference has expanded enough that the overall average level of knowledge has decreased significantly. It sounds like that's what you were seeing in the programming.
They've definitely become watering holes, these major conferences, rather than people going for the talks and things like that. It's more just everyone's there, therefore you can meet with a lot of other people. I know that captured our experience.
Wow. So I guess, is this something where gathering to be able to sort out what the latest technologies are, latest capabilities, walk through exploits is becoming a thing of the past. I'm curious about where that goes. And is this just we talk about security summer camp. Maybe it really is becoming that.
I think that there's a more nuance to that. I mean, if you really take time to spend time on some of these talks and some of the sessions, and the whole phenomenon, I think, of what we'll characterize as hallway con, where it's the number of informal conversations, you really can choose your own adventure. I would not, completely lose faith that, hey, it's just a big party. Though, if that's what you want to make Black Hat DefCon to be, it certainly can be, right? And no shortage of, happy hours 24/7. But I think if you really want to spend time in some of the workshops, some of the ancillary events, Diana Initiative, B-Sides, there's all kinds of ways to really get the knowledge that you want. You just have to be mindful about choosing your own adventure.
Justin raises a good point, bringing up B-sides. Some of the smaller regional conferences or the side conferences seem to be where some of the more technical talks are occurring. Although I think DefCon's still holding on to some of that DNA.
Agreed.
Certainly, for me, Black Hat, though, has become 2 days straight of meetings. And unfortunately, no happy hours. I need to start hanging out with Justin.
I didn't say I went to them. I just said that they were there. I can neither claim nor disavow my attendance.
Right.
I will say DEF CON absolutely had much deeper technical presentations, where actual code on the screen type of stuff. And so, yeah, I think if you're a deep technical person, that's the conference to go to.
I think this is also something that, we brought up in a report last year, is that I think for an industry, and as industry analysts, we have to really be thinking about how are people learning, in this agentic, we were just on the chat talking about, is security for AI or is AI for security? Is that going to replace the level 1 SOC analyst? Like, how are people actually learning? And I think that is something that's a huge issue for even many of the vendors that we see. I mean, with 400 some odd commercial vendors on the expo floor, many enterprises are constrained by the personnel it takes to operationalize some of this tooling. And I think that's one of the market constraints. And so you still see within DEF CON and B-Sides and many of these shows, like this desire to learn about technologies. And then, you see many vendors, they're trying to reach those audiences to teach them something. I still think that there's some disconnect between sort of the industry and the communities that are out there.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think we're way too, some talking heads are way too casually talking about people's livelihoods at this point. And in an industry where 40% of SOC alerts on average are uninvestigated. So it makes them seem out of touch when they start to say, hey, if you're a tier 1 analyst, better start looking for another job and this and that. It sounds ridiculous to people who are actually in the thick of it. And if you don't think defenders, who for 20 years have been holding things together with chicken wire and duct tape, aren't going to take these tools and run with them, anything that will help them, then you're not getting a good read on the industry as far as I'm concerned.
My favorite quote from a SOC analyst I spoke to, because I asked him, I said, what do you think about all this, automation, all the AI? Are you going to be looking for a job? And he goes, absolutely not. I'm looking forward to having dinner with my family every night.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I think that, in our broader research, one of the things that we're thinking about isn't so much for all the security for AI and AI for security. It's not so much personnel replacement. Maybe that happens sometime long down the road, but I think just in terms of reduced toil, and maybe that's just an augmentation of the existing metrics that we have, like improving MTDD, MTDR. That's I think where the spoils of the more immediate battles will go.
We saw that all over the startup village on the expo floor at Black Hat, at least anyway. There were so many plays that I know there's been some attempts to categorize, the AI SOC or, AI enabling the SOC. I just kind of think of them generally as SOC optimization because there's a lot of overlap and not really clear, distinct boundaries across some of them for sure. But there's some things that really came out, and that was one of them, is just, to your point, Dan, we're still not getting to 40% of alerts in the SOC on a typical day. Part of that is just, garbage in, not much out. You get overwhelmed by garbage in the process. So getting a better handle on just getting access to important insight in a sea of data that may or may not be well conditioned, well managed on its way to being available for triage and alerting. So a lot of the plays were about that. And there was kind of a subtle subtext in there, and I posted about this on LinkedIn a couple of days ago. For all the talk about platforms, that, one of the other buzzwords in the industry, a lot of these plays kind of give a tacit acknowledgement to the fact that there are all different kinds of telemetry sources, differences in format, differences in information all over the place. A lot of these plays exist just to get a handle on those differences, try and bring some unity to that, and raise the actionable information out of that as much as possible. It's been a holy grail in security operations, at least forever. And still is somewhat like that. But, the subtlety is that platforms are going to solve everything. You do have this diversity of telemetry and tools, and getting a handle on that, regardless whether you have a platform investment or not, remains a high priority.
Jeff Moss told us in 2023's Black Hat to view Gen AI as a prediction machine. And then he asked us, are our logs and data lakes ready? And I thought it was prophetic, and it ties directly to what you're saying. I mean, some of these agentic examples for the SOC are, we've noticed this problem here. Would you like to see all the other places this activity is occurring? I'm laughing because I'm like, oh yeah, please don't take that away from me as a SOC analyst. Not having to log into 5 different boxes and look for logs. So some of this stuff is going to be welcomed, and it's interesting. You bring up the data. For me, as I said, sat through 2 days of meetings, looked at a whole lot of architecture diagrams. And it seems like some of the security vendors have a real advantage with what I'll call sort of a data moat, and like a moat in the sense of a Warren Buffett moat, something that you've created that gives you some differentiation. Some folks seem to have figured out how to take all the different data sources they have about a specific condition, let's say a code base or a code through a system, and then engage the large language model. And so it's almost like, if you were to simplify it, think about like you're using ChatGPT, and the better your prompt is, the better the results are. And so I saw some real differences in security vendors sitting through those architecture diagrams of folks who put some real thought into how to leverage all the data they already have in an intelligent way and then engage an LLM, versus those who were kind of just passing things off and giving the results back to the user, and the results were a little inconsistent. So just an interesting differentiation as I sat through all these talks.
So is this something where that more mature approach is really building, I get back to a lot of the concerns about data pipelines and a lot of the enhancements of data that you've got, understanding what data quality is. Is that what that next stage is? I mean, because we've come from the days of the data lake, and we chuck everything in there, and we start pulling out old tires and shopping carts and all sorts of things. Because guess what? In the past, it didn't really matter, because we were kind of pulling data out of data lakes without particularly sophisticated tools, couldn't deal with a lot of the volume. But now we've suddenly got a class of tools that will pull out everything and characterize it and think that all of that data is absolutely lovely, and it's going to take those, old tires and shopping carts and glue them all together with all of the more valid stuff that we've got as part of that reservoir of data.
Starting to see some inroads in that direction. To Dan's point of asking about how does the technology map with the topology of what they're showing in the booth. There's some that are intriguing, and some that I came away definitely wanting to learn more about. So like the ability to recognize what, in some cases, one of the startups is talking about recognizing synonyms across different sources of telemetry, leveraging the ability of AI to do those recognitions, leveraging graph analytics to make the connections across those. So taking away some of the burden of what's effectively ETL normalization and correlation as we think of it in the old world that we use, that we're coming from. And also, it's sort of an emerging discipline around what some have called sec data ops. So not neglecting the fact that the management of the data and making it available is crucial to realizing insight, but also new tactics and new techniques for doing that look promising. I just want to learn more about them, see where they go. So there's some glimmer of promise in all the AI washing out there, and there is a ton of AI washing out there for sure.
Well, do we have to go through a lot of these data middle layers, the data consolidators, the Cribbles of the world to do that? Or on a certain level, it's sort of, ETL is dead, long live ETL. There's still a lot of basic data integration that has to happen. And that's a problem that's particularly acute in security.
Yeah, there's several different approaches to that. We'll probably revisit those again this year. We took a look at that in some detail in a technology business insight report on SecOps a couple of years ago. It kind of depends on where you're coming from on the vendor side and on the buyer side, what your priorities are. Do you want to build a data management architecture to weave these together? Do you prefer to look at tools that are offloading some of that lift, as I mentioned, with more of the graph-oriented abilities to correlate? And if so, it's not necessarily a silver bullet, so you want to be sure you understand what the prerequisites are for any kind of approach like that, which is why I say we really want to dig into these and learn more about them. But yeah, there's the approach to data federation, which takes your data where it lives and then provides correlation at the level of the analyst experience. We've seen all those approaches in past years, so it's going to be interesting to see where, to the extent that AI does actually make a difference in these plays. I'm a little skeptical because I still think that putting the data in good shape and making it available to this capability is going to be essential to success for any of them. But we'll see. I'm looking forward to this coming year. I think it's going to be interesting. I want to give a little airtime to one point. Sorry, Eric, but there was one thing that came up we do need to pay attention to, and that's the fact that the impact that identity is going to have on these and other trends. And that was also very much in evidence at Black Hat and DefCon both. And we've seen that in the form of, a very large deal recently. We're going to see more of that considering the potential autonomy with which agentic systems can work and who's responsible for their accountability and keeping them under control as well.
Yeah, that's a funny element of some of these talks. Or some of these vendor pitches. It's like, well, we can tell you or log or audit what the agent did, and we can put guardrails up and constrain it. And it's like, well, what? So we're talking about something that's acting so autonomously that we're just going to retrospectively try to figure out what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I think behavior analytics is going to come into play there, right? Because they're non-deterministic, right? So we're going to need to understand what their normal behavior is and start looking at it from that perspective.
Are we getting to a world in which we no longer blame users, but now we blame the agents? The agent clicked on that link. Can you believe it?
We've already seen a coding agent have an existential crisis when it wasn't able to solve a bug. We've seen it try to destroy the code base it was working on, and potentially, what's a word I can use here without getting blacklisted anywhere? Unalive itself, I suppose. And until it was basically called to heel and backed out of the system prompt that gave it that personality that was so inclined, it would have continued that direction. And the very legitimate question, it might sound like, overreaction, but what if that had been, driving a car, flying an airplane, or some other, operational deployment, not writing code necessarily, but where it had that kind of reaction. So yeah, the ability to watch and see what these non-deterministic functionalities do and keep them from being harmful, yeah, that's definitely going to be front and center.
I'm curious. There's so many other things that we could potentially dig into here, but we're running up on time. But I'm curious for each of you what your most hopeful takeaway was. What was the thing that you saw that gave you the most positive perspective in terms of what could be coming out in the not too distant future?
I'll go. I think the sheer number of systems that, and this, yes, you've seen DefCon and Black Hat just sort of migrate towards, people of all abilities, technical wise. And, my hope is that you have more and more what I'll call information skeptics, information security skeptics, or people who just don't understand or haven't had as much experience in the trade, or maybe they come from other lines of business, give visibility into Black Hat, DefCon, and some of those communities to really bridge sort of the organizational chasm. That's something that you hope will come about from the growth of some of these events, and hopefully we'll just get not so much hey, it's a whole bunch of security people preaching to a choir per se, but it's really, hey, these are net new practitioners, net new allies of information security, net new allies of security. That's kind of my hope.
Building that community.
I'm hopeful about the impact on people. It's not, we've had so much obsessive focus on AI for the last 2-3 years now. And we do talk about the impact on people, in a number of different ways. This is an area, Dan first called this out. We've been talking about this. This is an area where people still matter. Gaining an advantage over your adversary is a fundamentally human motivation. So the role for people in what information security, cybersecurity will become, really interested to see how that develops, because we don't really have a well-defined path to expertise here other than OJT. Or on-the-job training in a security operations center, or building secure code, or implementing data protection and privacy are things that we don't have really well-defined pathways for that short of hands-on experience. So what does this new world mean for people and making them more effective than they are today?
And Mark?
Yeah, one of the things I think about is around agentic AI is, again, to Scott's point, is making it easier, especially for the level 1, tier 1 analysts, right? Which, that's kind of a thankless job for a lot of those folks. It's a rite of passage, I guess. But, at the same time, if we can make them much more effective and make it more interesting for them, that's all the better. And one thing I wanted to call out around that data point that we brought up earlier, the 40%, alerts that they can't get to every day. One thing that's really interesting is that stat dropped 14 points over last year. Right. So we've been doing this survey for 5 years, right? And every year it's gone up about 6% on average every year until this year. And it dropped 14 points. Now, we don't really know why yet, but I think the next survey, if it continues to drop, you have to wonder if that's not some, of the impacts of AI and some of the advanced data analytics that we've got going on. So, I'm hopeful that people are going to be able to have dinner with their families.
Always our security OKR is slightly less terrible than last year.
Right.
See you back.
For me, there's just so much runway in what these tools can provide to us. Now, I'm a former developer, and so I've been messing around with this tutorial for, more than a month now. Like, I have to get into things to understand them. So I've been fooling around with this LLM agentic tutorial, and it's evaluating policies in PDF documents and then telling you, kind of exactly what you want to know. How many vacation days do I have? How do I book travel? This and that. And as I'm working through the tutorial, my only thought is, I wish I had this at work. And so, and that's probably the most basic example. I mean, it's basically a beginner example of how to work with these tools. So when I start to see the applications of these things to application security posture management, the major component of that is tool coordination. I start to think about developers working with somewhere between 12 and 24 tools almost on a daily basis. And then these tools having a coordination capability between them. Hey, tell me everything about X. Oh, well, there's a ticket in ServiceNow that says this. The code was last changed by this person. The amount of time that's going to save overall is profound. And so we've been talking about SOC examples. I'm talking about application security example. There are a ton of identity examples. I just see a lot of time savings on tasks we would rather not do, which then enables us to do more strategic things. And so, I don't want to be overly optimistic about AI, but I think polarizing opinions have sort of won the day on LinkedIn and other places. And I think people have to take a step back and start to look at, wow, this could be a major benefit. As Mark said, I might actually get to see my family and eat dinner with them if I work in a SOC.
Well, it's, as we've seen automation do in DevOps environments, it gets back to Justin's point. We're reducing toil. So I guess we just need to give those agents a little more room to let it all happen. But I guess we'll have to see where that goes. Well, this has been great. Again, so many more things we could be talking about. We'll have to save for a future episode. But thank you all for being here.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
Always a privilege.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Eric.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr for On Mediation, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. Please join us for our next episode, where we're going to be looking at enterprise and end consumer of technology-driven imperatives. We're talking about what the Open Networking Users Group has evolved into. I hope you'll join us then, because there's always something next in tech.